"She is the one," my grandmother announced, setting down her teacup with the finality of a judge passing sentence. "I have decided." I looked up from my book. My brother, the Duke of Marchmont, did not look up at all. He stood at the window of Havercroft Hall's great drawing room, arms folded behind his back, watching the November grounds as though they had personally offended him, which, knowing him, they might have. He had that gift. He could take offense at weather. "Grandmother," he said, in the tone a man uses when he is certain he is about to be unreasonable and intends to go through with it anyway, "you have said that of 4 women already this season." I said those women were suitable, the Dowager Duchess of Marchmont corrected, with the precision she applied to all things. She was 71, bird-boned, and sharper than any blade in the county. I said this one is the one. There is a distinction. My brother finally turned. I confess I watched him the way one watches a cart approaching a steep hill, with interest, and at a safe distance. "Which one?" he said. "Miss Cecily Bowen." A pause. I could see him searching for the name and not finding it quickly enough, which I suspected was exactly what our grandmother intended. "The companion," I offered helpfully. "She sits near the fire, reads aloud to grandmother, does not speak unless she has something worth saying." I paused. "You would not recognize the type." My brother looked at me with the expression he normally reserved for impudent retrievers. "She is a poor relation," he said to grandmother, not to me. "She is a gentlewoman of intelligence, character, and patience," our grandmother replied. "3 qualities you will find useful in a wife and have thus far shown no inclination to seek. Pour me more tea, Edmund." I poured the tea. My brother returned to the window, and I, who had been quietly observing Miss Cecily Bowen for the better part of a fortnight without once imagining I was watching my future sister-in-law, began to reconsider everything I thought I knew about my grandmother's timetable. She was not wrong about Miss Bowen, that was the thing. I had noticed her first at dinner 3 nights into the house party, when the conversation turned, as it always did at these gatherings, to the respective brilliance of people who were not present. The usual subjects: whose estate was encumbered, whose daughter had made a spectacular match, whose son had made a spectacular fool of himself at cards. Miss Bowen sat 2 places from my grandmother and said nothing for the better part of an hour, which at Havercroft was a form of achievement. Then Sir Aldous Prentice, who was earnest about everything and correct about almost nothing, made a grand pronouncement on the wool trade that contained 3 errors in as many sentences. Miss Bowen set down her fork. "I believe," she said, quietly and without any particular drama, "that the figure you are thinking of, Sir Aldous, applies to the eastern counties before the reform measures. The current picture is rather different." She named 2 numbers. She was right on both. Sir Aldous blinked. The table moved on. Miss Bowen picked up her fork again and returned to her pheasant as though nothing had occurred. My grandmother, across the table, looked precisely like a woman whose plan was proceeding on schedule. That was the beginning of it. I started paying attention after that, as one does when something turns out to be more interesting than expected. She was not showy. Her gown at dinner was good but not new. Her jewels were modest. She wore her dark hair simply, with a few strands escaping at the temple in a way that looked accidental and probably was not entirely. But the quality that kept drawing the eye was harder to name. She was simply, thoroughly at ease with herself. Not the brittle ease of a woman performing confidence, but the settled kind that comes from having no pretensions left to defend. My brother, I noticed, had stopped looking out windows on the evenings she was in the room. He had not yet noticed that he'd stopped. Our grandmother noticed. Our grandmother noticed everything. She arranged it with the efficiency of a field commander and the innocence of someone who had merely happened to plan a morning excursion to the old library at the East Wing, and had merely happened to send word to my brother that a folio he'd been seeking for years was catalogued there, and had merely forgotten to mention that she herself would not be attending on account of her knee, but that Miss Bowen would be along to assist. She told me all of this over breakfast the following morning, while spreading marmalade with an air of complete serenity. "You are incorrigible," I said. "I am efficient," she replied. "There is a distinction. I made my own way to the East Wing Library at 10:30, purely out of fraternal concern. I arrived in time to find my brother holding an old folio and Miss Bowen across the table from him, pointing to an entry on a page, saying something about the estate maps from the previous century. He was not looking at the maps. I withdrew before either of them saw me. At luncheon, my brother was quieter than usual. Miss Bowen sat at the far end of the table, and spoke to no one in particular about nothing important, and my brother watched her with the expression of a man who has just realized he has been walking in one direction for a very long time, and has only now looked up to see where he is going. That afternoon he found me in the billiards room. She argued with me, he said, without preamble. I trust you survived it. About the East Wing's eastern boundary, she was right, was she? He picked up a cue, regarded it, set it down. She did not apologize for being right. She simply moved on, as though being right was not a matter of particular significance. He said this the way a man says something that has genuinely surprised him, which for my brother was equivalent to another man being knocked from a horse. What he did not say, what I suspect he had not yet admitted to himself, was that he had stayed in that library long after the maps were settled, on a pretext so thin even our grandmother might have blushed to claim it. He had simply not wished to leave. I said nothing. I had learned from our grandmother that silence, properly deployed, is its own kind of scheme. He did not raise the subject again for 2 days. Then the snow came, a proper November fall, sudden and thick, and the house party that had been scheduled to decamp shifted its schedule, and everyone settled in for a 4th day at Havercroft with varying degrees of grace. My brother, who usually managed confinement about as well as a large and impatient animal, seemed not to mind. I knew why. I had seen him in the library again that morning, and in the drawing room the evening before, and at the far end of the gallery the afternoon prior, in each instance within 15 feet of Miss Cecily Bowen, in each instance apparently convinced that this was coincidence. It was on the 4th evening by the drawing room fire that I saw it happen. He had brought her a cup of tea, unbidden, without ceremony, simply crossed the room and handed it to her as though it were a perfectly ordinary thing for the Duke of Marchmont to do. She accepted it without making an event of it, said thank you in her quiet way, and returned to her book. He stood there a moment, looking at her reading, and the expression on his face was one I had never seen on him before, entirely unguarded. He sat down, not across the room, beside her. They spoke for an hour, I do not know about what. My grandmother, ensconced in her chair with her needlework, did not look up once. She did not need to. I could tell from the angle of her shoulders that she was radiantly, completely satisfied. When the party retired and I found myself briefly alone with her in the corridor, she patted my arm and said, "You see." "I see," I said. "You are a menace." "I am a grandmother," she said. "The distinction is smaller than you might think." He came to me the following morning before breakfast, still in his coat from a walk, cheeks red from the cold, looking simultaneously like a man who had arrived at a conclusion and a man who could not quite account for how he had got there. "I intend to speak with Miss Bowen," he said, "if she is willing. I expect she will be." I studied him. "You know, grandmother arranged the whole of it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with something very close to a smile, which on his face was the equivalent of another man bursting into laughter, he said, "She saw it before I did. She generally does. It does not diminish it." "No," I said, "I don't think it does." He spoke to Miss Bowen that morning, by the library window where the snow was still thick on the glass and a fire burned at the hearth. I did not witness it, but I saw them at luncheon an hour later, sitting together, not by accident, and the look she gave him, steady and warm and entirely her own, was not the look of a woman who had been maneuvered. It was the look of a woman who had seen something clearly and chosen it with open eyes. My grandmother across the table poured her tea and did not say a word. She did not need to. She had always known, from the first evening in the drawing room, what the rest of us were only beginning to understand, that Cecily Bowen was precisely the woman the Duke of Marchmont needed, and that the only person who required convincing was the Duke himself. He came around in the end, as she always knew he would. He simply needed the winter, and the library, and someone who did not apologize for being right, and a grandmother who had the good sense and the magnificent audacity to put them in the same room.